Morning, everyone. As we finish off chapter 1 today, so it might be a slightly longer session than we've had up until now, the text moves to focus once again on Basil's fascination with Dorian Gray. Yesterday I mentioned to you the idea that Dorian Gray has become a muse to Basil, and we're going to pick up some quotes where we see that coming through very clearly. So just to get us back in context, remember that Henry and Basil were discussing how Basil and Dorian had met, and Basil expressed his fascination with the character. There's quite a bit of banter that takes place between Basil and Harry at this point. You might want to just explore it. Again, we see the cynicism of Harry if you look at the top of page 15. And then again, his little epigrams that he is so fond of using. You might want to explore a couple of those. But I want to focus now on the idea of Dorian Gray as a muse to Basil. So we're picking it up more or less halfway down page 15, where he is explaining to Harry what he has come to mean to him. Harry asks him how often he sees Dorian, and this is Basil's response. He says, "Every day. I couldn't be happy if I didn't see him every day. He is absolutely necessary to me." Now that can be interpreted in two ways. One is that Basil has become dependent on Dorian in terms of relationship. But the other, of course, is the idea that Basil can't paint unless he has Dorian present. And you will see through the rest of this conversation that sometimes Dorian is the subject of his painting, so this portrait of Dorian Gray is not the only painting that Basil has done of him. He has used him as a subject to portray other characters from history. And that was very common in Victorian times, where you would have someone who posed for you, but you would actually be painting them as the character of another story. On the other hand, he suggests that Dorian simply needs to be present in order to inspire him to paint. So those are some of the things that we'll explore. And so he continues a couple of paragraphs down. He says, "He is all my art to me now." So that just reinforces what I've just said. And then if you carry on further along in that very long paragraph, you're about halfway down the paragraph now, he continues and he says, "His personality has suggested to me an entirely new manner in art, an entirely new mode of style. I see things differently. I think of them differently." Carries on about 6 or 7 lines down. "Unconsciously, he defines for me the lines of a fresh school, a school that is to have in it all the passion of the romantic spirit, all the perfection of the spirit that is Greek, the harmony of soul and body." Now, there are two things that we need to explore in those quotes. The first one is, again, the idea that Dorian Gray is the muse. He has inspired Basil, and he refers to him as encompassing the passion of the romantic spirit and the spirit that is Greek. The Greeks believed that the soul was the driving force behind the body, and that they therefore were inextricably linked. So for the Greeks, every object was imbued with some sort of spirit or passion, if you like. And Basil sees this as harmonious. He sees the idea of capturing the spirit as something that creates harmony within the painting. And that, of course, links in with his fear that he has put too much of his own soul into the portrait of Dorian Gray rather than capturing Dorian Gray's soul in the painting. Now, the idea of the soul is very important in chapter 2, and we're going to explore that in quite a bit of detail when we pick it up next week. The other suggestion is a comment by several critics that there is a romantic or a physical attraction of Basil to Dorian Gray, that Dorian Gray becomes a romantic obsession for him, not simply an artistic obsession for him. You can go that route of interpretation. There's certainly enough substantiation for it through the text. It is one of the interpretations of the critics, this idea that Basil is attracted to Dorian Gray, and that is part of his obsession with him. So if you have had a sense of that interpretation, just be aware of it as the relationship between Dorian and Basil develops, and just have a look at how you would substantiate it as the novel continues. So Basil makes this comment about the harmony of soul and body, and then he contrasts it with realism. So he continues in that paragraph, he says, "We, in our madness, have separated the two and have invented a realism that is vulgar, excuse me, and an identity that is void." So those of you who do art will be more familiar with the artistic function of realism. But very simply, realism objectifies things. So it's very much a case of what you see is what you get. If you are looking at a desk, that is what you are looking at. It is no other connotation to it. It is simply an object that has certain properties. It might have wood and metal as its properties, and together they combine to create the physical representation of a desk. There's no sense in realism of the soul. Your realists of the time would have been the ones who would have painted and depicted historical events, and they would have depicted them as accurately as they possibly could, and that was the sole function of that piece of art. There was no sense of needing to look beneath the surface. There was no sense of needing to analyze it and interpret it as we do with literature and art and music and so forth today, where we want to think about what it represents. We want to think about the spirit imbued in it. We want to think about the motive of the creator. Realism had none of that. What you saw was what you got, and that was the end of it. And so Basil's idea that this is vulgar is to him, again, the sense that for him art is about something more than just what you see. Of course, what it does in the way that that Basil describes it is it once again alerts Henry to his desire to meet this Dorian Gray. He becomes equally fascinated with him for very different reasons. And so in the next paragraph he says, "Basil, this is extraordinary. I must see Dorian Gray." There's the fascination, the predator. He's been alerted. He wants to see what it is about this person that is so interesting. Basil responds to him, and he says in the next paragraph, a couple of lines in, he says, "Dorian Gray is to me simply a motive for art." Can you see how he backs down a little bit? He's wary that he's revealed too much to Henry, and so he takes it back a step. And he says, "Dorian Gray is to me simply a motive in art. You might see nothing in him. I see everything in him. He is never more present in my work than when no image of him is there." So there's the muse again, the idea that Dorian absolutely influences everything that Basil does. And so Henry challenges him again. Why is it then that he won't exhibit the painting? And Basil responds to him. Couple of paragraphs down, he says, "Because without intending it, I have put into it some expression of all this curious artistic idolatry, of which, of course, I have never cared to speak to him. He knows nothing about it. He shall never know anything about it. So again, we get the sentiment of Basil having put something of himself into the painting, and he doesn't want people to see that. And he refers to it as artistic idolatry. He is afraid that people will see his feelings for Dorian through the painting. Now, this again is a suggestion or a foreshadowing of what is to come, because we know that later in the novel, Dorian is informed by Harry of the sentiment of Basil, and both Harry and Dorian use it against Basil. So it's very important, this idea that he doesn't want Dorian to know about his feelings. He doesn't want Dorian to know that he has become his muse, and he wants that contained. He's afraid of the implications of it should it be revealed. But of course, Harry, being the predator that he is, he uses this information when it suits him to do so. So we continue in the very next line, and Basil says, "But the world might guess it, this artistic idolatry, and I will not bare my soul to their shallow, prying eyes. My heart shall never be put under their microscope. There is too much of myself in the thing, Harry, too much of myself." There's a comment here about Victorian society where he speaks about not wanting to bare his soul to their shallow, prying eyes. He is afraid of what they will do with what they see, and how they might misconstrue it, how they might use it against him, how they might laugh at him or ridicule him for his sense, his depth of emotion. Remember, we've spoken about how the Victorians are very hypocritical, how they are shallow, appearance is everything to them, and therefore they have no compunction whatsoever in being critical of others and whatever they might read into others. And Basil is aware of it, and he doesn't want to expose himself. A couple of paragraphs down, he continues. He says, "I hate them for it. An artist should create beautiful things, but should put nothing of his own life into them. We have lost the abstract sense of beauty." There's aestheticism. The idea of art for art's sake, that it should simply be an object of beauty that has been created by the artist. And again, this is why Basil doesn't want to show it, because he's put more than just beauty into it. He's put his soul into it, and he doesn't want that to be. He almost feels as if he has failed in his artistic pursuit because he has done more than simply create something beautiful. But this is a lovely quote if you want to look at a quote for aestheticism, this one, and it links back to the preface and those quotes that we looked at in the preface. Okay, that's the end of part 1, and then I'll upload part 2 for you.